Africa, 17th century to date. Why Africans are more wary of the West than China and Russia. Since their first interaction with Westerners hundreds of years ago, Africans have not known peace. From slavery to violent colonial occupation to unconscionable exploitation, Westerners continue to treat Africans as subhuman and undeserving of enjoying human dignity and a quality of life comparable to other races. All African leaders who have dared to stand for their people's interests are seen and treated as enemies by Western powers. Here are notable African leaders who have been killed in various ways by Western powers directly or through proxies since Ghana gained its political independence in 1957. Reuben Nyobe, Cameroon, 1958, assassinated by the French army outside his village. The French found Niobe's ideas of true independence so unsettling that they destroyed all of his writings and forbade his countrymen from even mentioning his name in public after his death. Barthélemy Boganda, Central African Republic, 1959. Assassinated in a plane explosion during a campaign trip in his country. Boganda was blown to pieces in a small plane he was traveling in with 4 associates and 4 crew members from the city of Berberati to Bangui. He was regarded as too smart by the French for embracing Nkrumah and Sékou Touré's ideas of true independence. He was especially hated by the resident French business class, since he led the campaign to outlaw their forced labor practices in his country in 1946. Though a French newspaper reported that French investigators had found traces of explosives in the wreckage, the French authorities ordered the destruction of copies of the report in the Central African Republic. Felix Roland Mumi, Cameroon, 1960. Mumi was lured to Geneva, where he was murdered by poison, thallium, by a man believed to be a French Secret Service agent. He was the successor and ideological soulmate of Reuben Nyobe, who was murdered in 1958. Patrice Lumumba, Joe Okito, and Maurice Mapolo, DRC, 1961. Lumumba was executed by firing squad under the command of Belgian army officers and quickly dissolved in acid. Lumumba was a fiery and unapologetic Pan-Africanist who wasted no time in joining forces with Presidents Nkrumah and Sékou Touré to fast-track Africa's real independence. From his Independence Day speech, in which he denounced Western imperialism in the presence of a global audience, to his determination to right the wrongs done to his people by the Belgians, he left no one in doubt about his intentions. Lumumba's rule lasted only 10 weeks before a Western-sponsored crisis truncated his tenure. We now know for a fact that then U.S. President Eisenhower ordered his removal for being a danger to Western interests. Sylvanus Olympio, Togo, 1963. Olympio was summarily executed by a small group of soldiers, led by Sergeant Eyadema, who went on to rule for 3 decades as a French puppet. Like Sékou Touré, Olympio wanted nothing less than true freedom and independence for his homeland, both politically and economically. Thinking he could not possibly pay the fee, he was charged 800 million francs by the French for his desire to free his people from the economic trap they had laid for him. He stunned them by raising the amount and paying it off in record time. But that was not enough for them. They wanted him and all his colleagues to remain serfs. For persisting in his quest to break free, they decided to make an example of him as a deterrence to others. Only 2 days before he was to launch his own currency, which would free him from French control, they sent a group of military thugs to murder him. Though Brother Olympio initially escaped the hired assassins, sent to take him out by climbing over a wall to seek refuge in the compound of his next-door neighbor who was the American ambassador to his country, his guests refused to save him, and instead handed him over to the ignorant thugs in pursuit of him who wasted no time in murdering him in cold blood at the gate of the American ambassador's official residence. Mehdi Ben Barka, Morocco, 1965. Kidnapped in Paris and executed. His body was never found. Ben Barka was head of the National Union of Popular Forces and secretary of the Tri-Continental Conference in Morocco. An unapologetic nationalist, he was disappeared without trace from a street in Paris. It was an open secret that he was murdered by agents of the French state. Casto Osende Afana, Cameroon, 1966. Afana was killed, then decapitated by Cameroonian forces, teleguided by the Metropole. He was a fervent African nationalist, determined to revive Ruben Niobe's ideas and dream. He was tagged a Maoist communist, intent on upsetting the French-established economic order. Pierre Mulally, DRC 1968. Mulally suffered the worst kind of treatment before being killed. He was decapitated piecemeal and had his eyes plucked out while still alive. Mulally was a Congolese nationalist and education minister in Lumumba's short-lived cabinet, who led the Simba Rebellion of 1964, whose goal was to revive Lumumba's dream of a strong, independent Congo. With help from his Western masters, Mobutu, the treacherous and kleptocratic puppet leader of the Congo, lured Mulally back home from exile in 1968 by promising him amnesty and reconciliation. However, as soon as he arrived, he was arrested, publicly tortured, and killed in the most gruesome way, after which his remains were dumped into the Congo River. Eduardo Mondlane, Mozambique, 1969. One of the intellectual giants of Africa's liberation struggle, Mondlane was assassinated by parcel bomb while leading the freedom movement in exile. Mondlane was killed in Tanzania with help from native collaborators of the Portuguese, who he was trying to uproot in his homeland. To this day, all efforts to tell the full story of his betrayal and death are stymied. Operação Mar Verde. Conakry, November 20th, 1970. The Portuguese, working in concert with the French, openly invaded Guinea-Conakry with a warship in an operation codenamed Green Sea, where Nkrumah, Cabral, and many other notable Pan-Africanists were living. 500 innocent Guineans were killed in the two-day operation. The UN passed Resolution 100 to condemn the outrage. The U.S. abstained. Osagefo Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana, 1972. Without doubt, the most consequential African leader since 1951. Osagefo died from food poisoning at a hospital in Eastern Europe. He was co-president of Guinea-Conakry. Labeled by the CIA and other Western intelligence agencies as the most dangerous black man alive, Nkrumah was the #1 enemy of the West from 1951 until his death. Even after they successfully overthrew his regime in Ghana in 1966 by proxy, they could not let rest as long as he was alive. Sékou Touré had offered to resign and let him lead Guinea, which offer Nkrumah declined. But the co-presidency position he took was not ceremonial. He at times observed cabinet meetings, and all cabinet ministers in the Touré government were obligated to consult with him regularly. He even traveled with Touré on foreign trips and continued to write books and articles to inspire young revolutionaries around the continent and the diaspora. Osagefo succumbed to the slow poisoning of his food in a hospital in Romania, having lost his trusted personal chef, suddenly only 6 months after his arrival in Conakry in 1966. Western secret agents involved in his overthrow were all promoted. Amilcar Cabral, Guinea-Bissau, 1973. Assassinated at point-blank range on a street in Conakry. Cabral was an agricultural engineer by training. He was also one of the brightest and most inspiring young revolutionaries of his time. He was killed by a paid assassin on a street in Conakry 2 years before his native Guinea-Bissau gained its independence. He was the founder of the PAIG, or Partido Africano da Independencia, da Guinea Cabo Verde, African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde. His Portuguese enemies blamed his death on internal Pegs rivalry and other ludicrous theories. But Africans know better. Emperor Haile Selassie, Ethiopia, 1975. Cold-blooded assassination after his overthrow in 1974. An unapologetic believer in African independence. Tafari's role as a founding member and first host of the Organization of African Unity and unbridled support for liberation movements around the continent had made him an enemy of the former European colonizers and their allies. Richard Ratzimandrava, Madagascar, 1975. Assassinated. Colonel Ratzimandrava was killed after only 6 days in office because of the changes he had announced he wanted to make to better his people's lives, which were deemed unfavorable to Western interests. Herbert Chitepo, Zimbabwe, 1975. Assassinated. A brilliant thinker and lawyer, Chitepo recognized that the real enemy was the exploitative Western economic system imposed on his people, and therefore mobilized them to challenge and change the status quo. This made him an enemy of the West. A British author claimed publicly that a former soldier of the British Special Air Service, SAS, Hugh Hind, was responsible for Chitepo's murder, but nothing came out of the crime. General Murtala Muhammad, Nigeria, 1976. Assassinated in a seemingly normal botched coup attempt. Popular Gen Muhammad spent only 7 months in office, but started and completed more development projects than any of his predecessors. He was also the initiator of the relocation of Nigeria's federal capital from the congested southern city of Lagos to a more serene and spacious location in the center of the country. However, he had refused to accept a $1 billion loan offer from the IMF to build a steel plant, which his successor quickly accepted. Yet after spending billions in interest payments on that loan since 1980, the steel plant remains incomplete to this day. Marian Ngouabi, Republic of Congo, 1977. Assassinated. Ngouabi was long accused of harboring leftist views and was deemed a troublemaker within the army for criticizing the French-backed president of his country. Demoted from commissioned officer to soldier for his views, he was arrested and detained on the orders of the president. It was while in detention that his allies in the military freed him and launched a coup that culminated in him taking charge of his homeland from 1968 to 1977. But Ngouabi's powerful foreign enemies never forgave him. They struck in 1977 and ended his life. President Ali Soili Comoros, 1978, assassinated. Though Soili took on several revolutionary battles to change the minds and ways of his people, from getting rid of the wasteful and costly traditional marriages and funeral rites to empowering the youth and lifting restrictions on female dress codes, his biggest crime was probably his open hostility and antagonism towards his country's colonial overlord. Soili was overthrown by the same French mercenary, Bob Denard, who had helped install him. He was killed while trying to escape house arrest after his overthrow. William Tolbert, Liberia, 1980. Assassinated in a coup led by Sergeant Samuel Doe, a descendant of repatriated former slaves on American plantations, who constituted 2% of the Liberian population, but had controlled all important public positions in Liberian public life. From 1847 until his succession of Tubman in 1972, Tolbert had started altering the way things were done in his country. He appointed the first indigenous African to his cabinet and started making other changes from Liberia's foreign policy to questioning lopsided extractive resource deals with Western companies. Many believe these were his crimes. Ahmed Sekou Touré, Guinea-Conakry, 1984. Died under anesthesia on an operating table. An unapologetic Pan-Africanist, co-founder of the OAU, the Casablanca Group, first proponent and sponsor of ANC's armed wing in West Africa, and host to Nkrumah, Cabral, Miriam Makeba, Stokely Carmichael, and many other African nationalists, Toure was no friend of the West. He visited Paris in 1983 after 2 decades of French covert and overt operations to eliminate him and appeared well and hearty, having delivered several public lectures to the French establishment on Africa and his positions. However, in less than a year after his visit, he supposedly had a heart condition that could not be fixed in Morocco, where he had gone for checkup. Lured to America, he died on the operating table in Cleveland, Ohio, where he was assured by the Americans that their doctors could easily correct his ailment. In 2011, a former French ambassador to Guinea confessed publicly in Conakry that he was aware of 52 plots by his country to kill or remove Touré from office. Samora Machel. Mozambique, 1986. Machel was assassinated by the remote electronic hijacking of his helicopter's navigation system, leading to its crashing into the side of a mountain near the Mozambique-South Africa border. An avowed Marxist, Machel was regarded as an enemy of Western interests in Africa from his investiture as president in 1975. He had been fighting the Western-funded armed wing of his political enemies, Renamo. His death was believed to be the handiwork of the then-apartheid government in South Africa, working with their Western allies. Captain Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso, 1987. Assassinated. Soldier, Pan-Africanist, and exemplary pragmatic leader, young Sankara was the most popular military leader of his generation. Among his many revolutionary initiatives was a program aimed at decolonizing the mind of his people who, like most Africans, had lost almost all confidence in their own abilities to make a difference in their lives from agriculture to industry and administration. He understood the poverty of his people and showed that sensitivity in the modest way he lived. However, his uncompromising stance against French neocolonialism did not sit well with his country's colonial overlord. French President Mitterrand is on record warning him publicly to change course. Not happy with his ways, they took him out by using his trusted but ambitious friend, Tavio Amorim, Togo, 1992. Assassinated. A member of the Olympio school of thought, Amorim was seen by the French as a mortal enemy. He was believed to have been killed for openly embracing and espousing the real independence and Pan-African ideology of Olympio Nkrumah, Marcus Garvey, and Sheikh Anta Diop. Ibrahim Bare Mainasra, Niger, 1999, assassinated in a coup. In his last 2 years in office, Mainasra was getting closer to the Libyan leader, Colonel Gaddafi, a relationship his country's colonial overlord and the West generally disapproved of. Laurent Kabila, DRC 2001. Assassinated by proxies. Kabila's dalliance with communist China and notable anti-Western revolutionaries like Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, who spent a year with him in eastern DRC to help him fight the Western-propped kleptocrat. Mobutu, in the early 1960s, had marked him as an enemy of the West. Many believe the latter used Rwanda and Uganda as proxies to take Kabila out. Given his country's proven vast, valuable mineral deposits, it's an open secret that the West is determined to keep the DRC in its current unstable and weak state to maintain its death grip on her natural resources. Any nationalist Congolese leader who is seen as more friendly to enemies of the West is one that must be eliminated by any means necessary. The West's quest for a puppet leader in the DRC continues. Muammar Gaddafi, Libya, 2011. Assassinated by mobs backed by NATO forces. From WikiLeaks exposes, we now know that Gaddafi was killed for trying to unite Africa and return the continent to the gold standard, away from the manipulation of the World Bank and IMF. And, unlike most African leaders, Gaddafi did have an undeniable record of starting and completing mega projects, like his desert to breadbasket Green Revolution, that changed the lives of millions of his people for the better. Having even a third of Africa with their resources under Gaddafi's control or great influence was something the West dreaded. Obama signed off on his death because he was threatening to wipe off his own people. It is instructive to note that when NATO went after Gaddafi led by French jets, their first targets included civilian and agricultural infrastructure, not just military. Libya has been ruined and remains unstable since Gaddafi's death. Idris Deby, Chad, 2021. Assassinated. Deby was a creation of the West. As a member of a clan that accounts for only 3% of the Chadian population, and with little education, he had very little prospects of ever leading his country through legitimate means. But based on the crucial role he played in the Western-supported proxy war between Chad and Libya in the 1980s, he was helped to overthrow Hussein Habre. He went on to brutalize his people and loot his country, changing constitutions and conducting sham elections for over 30 years. However, in the last 3 years of his life, he had become increasingly open about the secret of his long stay in power and who urges him privately to stay in power anytime he tries to leave. His closeness to Nigeria and sincere efforts to end the Boko Haram menace, plus his loose lips, may not have gone down well with his Western overlords. Deby was suspected to have been conveniently taken out while leading troops in the front line, to make way for his more controllable 29-year-old son to start a new cycle of misgovernance in Chad, something currently playing out as competent candidates seen as unfriendly to France are being killed to assure young Deby stays in power. John P. Magufuli, Tanzania, 2021. Assassinated by heart attack. No African leader in the past 20 years has won the respect, support, and admiration of Africans worldwide like Magufuli did. He was smart, incorruptible, and resolute. He started and completed major infrastructural projects on time, and as budgeted without taking expensive IMF loans. He renegotiated loans he had inherited from his predecessors, saving his country billions of dollars. He also took on Western multinationals that had for decades been ripping Tanzania off through lopsided contracts and tax evasion. He made a major British mining firm pay back $1.9 billion in taxes and royalties they had cheated the country. He eliminated wasteful spending, flew commercial when he needed to travel abroad, and fought corruption blindly with passion. In only 5 years, he moved his country from low income to middle income status. Because of these actions, his popularity soared on the continent, giving rise to a new terminology, Magufulification, as an analogy for purposeful leadership. But to the West, he was a grave threat who had to be eliminated somehow. Wrap up. While not exhaustive, these are most of the high-profile victims of the West's quiet war on Africa. None of these deaths are fictional. Though most of these crimes were committed with some native complicity, the instigators and sponsors are known. The fact that Western media dismisses the exposure of these consequential crimes as conspiracy theories or controversial allegations shows their racist mindset in which Africans are viewed as less than human or incapable of discerning the source of their troubles. While Africans may not like or trust the Chinese and Russians, they are very much aware of the pervasive and deleterious effects of Western intrusion in their lives going back 5 centuries, from slavery to colonialism, neocolonialism, vulture capitalism, and the sponsoring of endless wars to keep Africa in a state of permanent crises that would enable its continuous looting by Westerners. Africans should not allow China and Russia to do to them what the West did, but otherwise it makes sense that they're more wary of the West than the Easterners.